Hello again, and welcome to today's webinar, Designing Tableau for Everyone with Colin Smith. My name is Sophie Sparks. I'm the Community Manager here at the Information Lab, and it is absolutely fantastic to have everyone joining us today. Colin and I are based in the UK, so from us, I hope you're having a lovely lunchtime and a good afternoon. But depending where in the world you're joining in from, hope you're having a good morning or a good evening as well. Now, just before I hand over to Colin, I'll let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and I will post the recording out to our YouTube channel and send everybody out the link by tomorrow. So if you do miss anything, or if you'd like to go back and have a look at something Colin mentions today, just wait for that video recording link to be posted. And with that, Colin, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Sophie. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar today. I'm really excited to be giving you all this information and here with you. Just a note, we've got a lot of ground to cover today. So I will be holding our Q&A towards the end, but you can use that Q&A function that you see in the bottom of your Zoom screen. I just won't be taking a look at it until after the content is done. Same with the chat. But if you're having problems, Sophie will be monitoring those, so you can communicate with her there. All right, let me share my screen with you all. Welcome. So I am Colin. I'm a consulting analyst here at the Information Lab. And this year I've been getting really interested in accessibility, particularly when it comes to data visualization in Tableau. So I've been doing a lot of research and trying to incorporate some of these principles around accessibility into my personal work, and thought it would be a great opportunity to kind of share some of the things that I've learned around accessibility and universal design, which we'll talk a little bit about in a moment. So the agenda for this talk, first I'm going to be discussing just an introduction to accessibility and universal design, how those apply to Tableau. I'll give you some general principles to follow, and again, talk about how these apply within Tableau. Then we're going to discuss a few specific accessibility scenarios and how we can specifically design for those. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A. There's going to be some opportunities for audience participation in this webinar. So get ready to answer some questions, fill out some polls. So this will be a little bit interactive. So first off, I have a question for you, which is, have you ever included design elements for a non-traditional user in your data visualizations? And what I'm going to do here is launch a poll that you'll be able to log into so that we can answer this question together. Let me bring that up now. So you'll see there's a QR code on the screen that I'm sharing. And if you scan that QR code, you should be able to come into this Slido poll. Sophie will also be sharing this in the chat, a link to this poll. So if you want to do it on your computer browser, you can do it by clicking on the link that Sophie dropped, or on your phone, you can scan that QR code that you see. So here's our question. Have you ever included design elements for a non-traditional user? All right. Seeing a majority of folks saying yes, which is really exciting to see that. Maybe during the Q&A, I can get some of those stories from you all. About a quarter of you are saying, I'm not really sure if I have or not. And then 20% are saying, no, you haven't. And that's totally fine. I don't think before I started looking into this, this year, 2021, I had ever included design elements for somebody who's a non-traditional user. So don't feel bad if your answer is no. And if your answer is yes, I'd really love to hear that story and maybe we can do that a little bit later. Just going to switch back to my presentation here. And before we get too deep into this, I just want to have a note on language, because this can be a stumbling block for a lot of people. Language, just as a principle, is constantly changing. There's no firm rules, and what's okay for one person is just that. It's what's okay for one person. We don't want to assume that everybody who has a disability has the same standard. For instance, disabled we use as a descriptor, not as a class of people. So for instance, it's not good to refer to something like the disabled. We want to make sure that we put people first in this language. Beyond that, it's better for us to be specific. So are we talking about people with color blindness, people with restricted motor function, blind people, or people with visual impairments? The way that you design to include all of these people can be different or overlap. So being specific actually helps you be inclusive, as well as make the correct design choices for the moment. In the case of people who use screen readers or keyboard navigation, what we're talking about is users of assistive technology. That's the term that we typically use. And there's a whole host of reasons why somebody might use these. Exactly like there's a whole host of reasons why somebody might use an accessible ramp. So it's best not to presuppose why. And finally, just be open to change if someone corrects you or asks you to adapt your language. Refer to point 1, language is constantly changing. I like this quote from the UK government. It says, "Don't be too precious or too politically correct. Being super sensitive to the right and wrong language and depictions will stop you from doing anything." I like that a lot. So don't get too clammed up about the language, but do try to be respectful and open to change. All right, so another interactive question. This time the question is, what are some reasons a person might have difficulty interpreting a Tableau dashboard? We're just going to do a little brainstorming for a minute or two here. So I'll open up this poll, and we should start to see your responses appear on this screen. Might take a minute or two, that's okay. Just have a think. Starting out with a joke, they work in sales. Yep. Yeah, font size, color blindness. If there's not clear instructions in the text boxes, or somebody is data illiterate, and we want to be sure that we're clear about what we mean when we say that. Maybe that's just that they haven't had the right kind of training yet. Sometimes they're not sure even what Tableau is. Again, sometimes it's just fundamental training that people need, not necessarily a specific design choice. Too much data on the screen. Yeah, that can definitely cause problems for a lot of people, whether you're using a screen reader, whether you're using just a keyboard, or whether you have some neurodiversity like ADHD or dyslexia. Malintended aveugle, I'm not sure what those words mean. Maybe you can put a definition in the chat there, that would be helpful. I see another one saying they haven't seen a dashboard before, or it's too gray, that there's not good storytelling. Yeah, this is great, because this is a combination of things that have to do with both universal design, so how do we design better for everybody, as well as accessibility design, which is how do we design around specific disabilities. Their desired language is not available. That's one that we commonly don't think about, but if someone's first language is not necessarily English, how do they interact with our charts and graphs, our dashboards? Great. And overly complex. These are all super helpful. Oh, I'm seeing an alt text one as well. We'll talk about alt text a little bit later on if you don't know what that is. Unclear labels, yep. And not enough contrast between colors. Wonderful. So we'll talk about a lot of these over the course of the next hour. Thanks for that. So just a quote to frame what we're talking about here. from Ben Schneiderman, who's the founding director of the Human-Computer Interaction Laboratory. This is the guy who actually invented the tree map I recently found. So if you've ever used that chart type, that was Ben Schneiderman. The purpose of visualization is insight, not pictures. I think that this is really important to not lose sight of as we're talking about accessibility in Tableau. It can be exciting to use Tableau because oftentimes it works for us. It just clicks in your head. And it's because of that visual element that it does that. But fundamentally, the reason we're creating visualizations is to provide more insights, not to necessarily create a picture. So if there's a way to provide insight that's not necessarily visual, but just as effective, we want to be able to provide that as well. So what about when it comes to Tableau? So my kind of working definition of accessibility is ensuring that as many people as possible can use, understand, and have access to our visualizations. There's no silver bullet here that you're going to design a dashboard, a single dashboard that works for everybody, but we can have a mentality that lets us create insights that will work for everyone. Beyond that, I think it's important to remember that data visualization itself is a form of accessibility technology. So data visualization was developed so that people could take large tables of numbers and text and turn them into something meaningful, to see patterns, to make that data more accessible and more interpretable. So fundamentally, data visualization is about accessibility, but it can also be a move away from accessibility for people who have certain disabilities. Another term I want to talk about here is universal design. So I really like this quote. I'm borrowing it from Kyle Waterhouse, who's the accessibility project manager at Alteryx, which is a data analysis software company. I'll just read this aloud for everyone. Universal design is the idea that you design for everyone. You don't just design for, quote, normal users. And at the same time, you don't just design for users of assistive technology. You design for everyone who could possibly use it. A good example of this is you don't just build stairs up to a door and then bolt a ramp on the side. You create stairs that incorporate a ramp, something that's pleasing to the eye and also serves all the needs of anybody who could use it. There's a few good examples of how you might see this totally outside the realm of data visualization. For instance, closed captioning. So this is on broadcast television, and actually now it's on YouTube videos and things like that. Originally designed for people with hearing impairments, but can be really helpful even if you don't have a hearing impairment. Say you're in a crowded bar and you're really trying to see what's going on in the game. You want to see that commentary. Or I'm sure many of you have used captions on YouTube videos before. Road cuts or curb cuts. A lot of times universal design, we don't even notice it, but these curb cuts are an example of universal design. So whenever we have a crossing across the street, there's legal requirements in many countries to have a curb cut so that people who use wheelchairs can access the road crossing. But this is universal design because it helps all sorts of people. So you can imagine if you're pushing a baby stroller, it helps. If you're loaded down with a bunch of groceries, it might help. And that's sort of the fundamental principle of universal design is even though we might design it for a particular accessibility need, oftentimes it winds up helping a much larger slice of the population. Another quick one is just these long-handled doorknobs. I like this one because, again, it can seem invisible until you need it, but these are much easier to use for people with motor impairments. And so there's been a large move towards these kind of handled doorknobs. And what about in Tableau? Okay, so getting now specifically into Tableau and data visualization design, take a moment, I'll give you a few seconds just to look at this chart on my screen and think about what elements of universal design might exist here. Some might be obvious, and some might be almost invisible to you. You might just think about it in your head. You might jot a couple down. All right, I'm going to go through some of the ones that I included on this chart on purpose. So I've labeled the line directly in a high contrast color. So black on white here. You can see we've got technology labeling that line directly. I've also used a colorblind accessible palette. So if you were to look at this, particularly with red-green color blindness, each of these colors would be differentiable. That's not true for all forms of color blindness, but red-green is the most common. I've labeled the marks in multiple ways. So in addition to differentiating these lines by color, I've also overlaid points that have different shapes. So I've got circles here for furniture, squares for office supplies, and diamonds for technology. I've made the text size larger. So I think the default in Tableau is about 10 points, which is kind of just at the bottom range of accessible font size. So I try to shoot for at least 12 points in my charts when I have the choice. I've also bumped up the mark size. So using the size card in Tableau, I've increased both the width of the line and the size of these marks that I've overlaid it. That will help with people who have visual impairments, or if you're just looking at the chart from far away. Again, a universal design principle. It's not just for people who have accessibility needs, it actually helps everybody. I'm avoiding visual overload when it comes to marks, colors, and categories. So I'm not, starting to use 7, 8, 9, or even more colors and shapes. I'm trying to limit it just to the data that needs to be there. And if you were building this in a dashboard, what you might do is introduce a filter so that people can limit the number of marks that are in the view. At the bottom here, I've included a caption to describe the chart. Now, this provides a couple helpful things. A couple people mentioned in our opening brainstorm that not having enough text or instruction or description could be a hindrance for people. So this caption function in Tableau lets us provide a little bit more description of what's going on in that chart. And it's generated automatically, but you can adapt it as well. So I can see here it says the trends of sum of profit for order date quarter, which, maybe there's a way that could have been made a little bit more clear. But the nice thing is you can edit these captions as well as put dynamic text in them. Color and shape shows detail about category. The marks are labeled by category and sum of profit. If somebody is using a screen reader, which we'll talk about a little bit later, it would be able to read that description out loud. I'm also showing the most recent value on the chart. So this helps, again, for a variety of reasons. One, if somebody is just using a keyboard to navigate this chart, they can't actually hover over these marks and see the values. So labeling the most recent, the most important data is very important. Also, if someone was maybe going to print this out or copy it into a PowerPoint, that could be helpful. And then I've also, in the title, described how to interact with the chart and see the underlying values. So you can hover over a line to see specific values or use Control-Shift-Enter to view the underlying data. So 2 different ways to see those values, not just assuming that everybody can see those tooltips. So not all of these elements will be possible with all charts, but the more universally you can make your design, the more people will be able to access and understand it. Sometimes we have to make the argument to our clients or our companies why accessibility is important. So I think it's helpful to have a couple arguments in your back pocket for why this needs to happen. Again, this is adapted from Kyle Waterworth, who's just a font of knowledge. I would recommend looking him up. He's from Alteryx. One, economics. So just from a British perspective, 18% of the working age population of Britain has a disability. That's defined by the Equality Act of 2010. Many companies already have policies around accessibility. And this percentage would actually probably be higher if we included every sort of reason a person might have an issue seeing one of our charts, for instance, like color blindness. It's often not unusual for clients, this is speaking from the consulting world, to ask about accessibility when it comes to submitting tenders for work. So if you or your company can be among the best when it comes to data visualization, you can have a competitive advantage. Goodwill is another thing not to discount. Being a strong and vocal advocate of universal design can get your work noticed. And users of products that are particularly accessible are often really vocal advocates for those products. So it can be a good way, again, to get you noticed, to get your work out there while doing the right thing by people. Legal, again, not to be discounted. Some clients, especially governments or companies receiving state funds like universities, have a legal requirement to make accommodations for people who use assistive devices. And moral. I mean, living with a disability can make life hard in a lot of ways. And wherever we can avoid making that harder, we should do that. So what follows are a couple more quotes that help me get sort of in the right frame of mind to design with accessibility in mind. This one's from Doug Scheppers, who's the director of Fizz Studio, which is an accessible data viz startup. It says, don't look at this, and by this he's referring to accessibility, as a requirement or an obligation, another checkbox to tick off. Look at accessibility as an opportunity to hone your skills, to move beyond the ordinary, and to provide an intentional experience for your users. I really like that quote because it kind of puts me in the right mindset of like, okay, I want to take on this challenge. This is an exciting opportunity to grow and try something different. All right, moving on to some general principles that you can use to help guide your development in Tableau. And these are from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. This is the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, if you've ever heard of W3C schools or things like that. They publish these guidelines, which are the standard for making content on the internet accessible. Much of it also applies to our data visualizations, which in the case of Tableau are typically hosted in a browser. So some of these top level principles are perceivable, navigable, adaptable, and distinguishable. And I'm going to dive into each one of these a little bit deeper now. So perceivable. What can we do to make our dashboards more perceivable? We want to provide text alternatives to any non-text content. So if someone is using, for instance, a screen reader, nothing in your chart area will be interpretable by that screen reader. However, the view underlying data pane, if you've never seen that before, you can find it by clicking on a mark and clicking kind of like the little dashed lines in the control buttons. In the browser, you can use Control-Shift-Enter. That brings up a table that has the underlying data in it, and it's already aggregated to the level of detail that's in your view. So it's really handy. But if you are using server, sometimes admins have blocked that ability. So wherever possible, you want to enable that view underlying data feature. And always, it's so easy, use alt text on images and buttons. So you can see there's this alt text box down here. And what that does is provide a text description or alternative to any sort of image or button. So this is helpful in a couple ways. One, if someone's browser can't render that image for some reason, it will display the text instead. And for someone who's using a screen reader or has a visual impairment, they can use that alt text to understand what the image is. Oh, yep, highlighting that alt text again. Next one here is navigable. So we want to make it straightforward to navigate the dashboard with or without a mouse. How do we do this? Well, we do it in part by setting a sensible focus order. The focus order is the order that a user can tab through your dashboard. We'll do a little exercise with this later. But as you press the tab button, you can move through the elements of a browser page and then actually the dashboard itself. So the focus order is the order that happens. It means the order that someone could interact with your dashboard and the order that a screen reader will read out the elements of your dashboard. So you can see a sensible focus order in this sample dashboard would be the title first, then maybe these filter options that they could interact with, then going to some of the high-level KPIs before going into the actual chart area. And then finally finishing up with some extra ways to view the data and attribution. Another element, another part of making your dashboard navigable is using the default titles whenever possible. So using that dashboard title option in Tableau, using the chart title options, using the legend title options. I know sometimes as people get more and more familiar with using Tableau, you want to push it to the extent of its design capabilities. And so you start designing custom titles and things like that. While those could be visually appealing and helpful, they're actually really difficult for screen readers to interpret. So however, we can use those default titles that come in our charts, legends, filters, and dashboards, it's better. I'll show you in a moment how a dashboard actually gets spoken by a screen reader. Next, adaptable. So this is just understanding that people might access your viz in a lot of ways, sometimes unexpected ways. So they might be accessing your visualization using a tablet or their phone. That tablet might only be able to display your visualization in a certain orientation. So what can we do to help with this? Well, Tableau has lots of options for setting different layouts. That's one way. Another way is making sure that we don't necessarily reference locations on our dashboard, or if we do, that we do it with some more information available. So here, instead of saying, okay, click the button at the top right or click on the filter on the right side, we say, click on the filters to choose a particular week and region. So then when they get to this filter, and they're focused on this filter and they hear select week, we know that's the filter that's being referred to in the title, rather than just trying to describe it as a location where, if somebody was on a tablet or on their phone, that filter might not actually appear to the right anymore. Okay, distinguishable is the last principle that I'm going to talk about here. And this is about making elements of your chart easy to read and understand. So we talked a little bit earlier in that universal design slide about overlapping shapes on lines. That can be helpful. Color palettes are good, but most are just designed for red-green color blindness. And there are other kinds that those colorblind palettes don't actually serve. So providing multiple different ways of interpreting those differences is really valuable. Another one is contrast. This is a huge one that is kind of one of the bugs in my bonnet when I'm thinking about defaults in Tableau. The WCAG standards, which I talked about earlier, suggest a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1 for normal text, 3 to 1 for large text. Sophie's going to drop a link to one option that you can use to check contrast in the chat. This one that I've got a picture of here, it's from Coolers. This isn't something that we can just look at and know if it's contrast accessible or not. So it often requires using a tool. Here I've used just the default Tableau orange on white to show that actually the color contrast here does not meet the standards. So we wouldn't want to use this color orange on white. Funny story, I was reviewing this presentation just the hour before giving it, and I realized many of my slides actually were not contrast accessible. So I did a little bit of last minute switches on my presentation to you all to make things past that accessibility guideline. So always learning, always growing. You know, that's the mindset you have to have. One important thing to note here, the default tooltip label in Tableau has this kind of grayish color that it uses to present the field name that's being represented in the tooltip. That gray is actually does not conform to the default, or sorry, the standard for WCAG contrast visibility. If you do want to make it contrast accessible, you either need to make it bigger, so it would need to be 18 point or 14 point and bold to pass at that color. Alternatively, you can just make it black. That would be my recommendation. But that default gray in the tooltip is not contrast accessible. All right, another quote here, this time from Kelly Gupton, who is the Product Management Senior Director at Tableau. Kelly has lots of great presentations that I'll link to at the end of this presentation if you want to do a deeper dive into this topic of accessibility technology in Tableau. I really like this one. Accessibility is a design choice. Retrofitting is often harder than designing from scratch. So it's a lot more difficult to get handed over a dashboard and say, okay, now this needs to be accessible to, say, a screen reader, than to be designing with that in mind from the very beginning. I'm going to let that be an introduction to these particular scenarios, designing for users of particular assistive technologies. The two we're going to be talking about are keyboard navigation and screen readers. I now have another interactive challenge for you. So Sophie is going to drop a link to a Tableau public dashboard that I made quite some time ago, so be easy on me. What I want you to do is click on that link to go to the visualization, and then take your hand off the mouse immediately. And what I want you to do on that dashboard is just change it from pounds or kilograms to pounds. So this is, I'll show you what the dashboard looks like. What I want you to do is, without using the mouse at all, change those units from kilograms to pounds. And I'll give you a minute to try and do that. Afterwards, I'm going to ask you what your experience was like doing that. Maybe 10 more seconds to try on that. Okay, so I'll let you use your mouse again now. What I'd like you to do is give me some feedback on how that was for you. What was your experience like? Particularly, I'm interested in, were you able to switch that filter? Or I guess it's a parameter switcher. What was particularly difficult or unexpected, or what seemed natural in doing it? So I've posted up another question on Slido. We're seeing the first one saying, impossible for me. Again, questions, were you able to find it? What was difficult? What was unexpected? What seemed natural? Yeah, seeing another one difficult. Don't feel like you have to answer all these questions. Seeing some people saying that the tab didn't work. Oh, I'm sorry for someone that it wasn't able to load in the available time. It's just a browser issue. Yeah, so much tabbing. Then you had to guess how to switch the choice. A lot of folks saying that they couldn't even tab to that filter dropdown. And for those of you who aren't aware, you can use the tab button to navigate around your browser. All right. Somebody's saying focus order could be improved. It's not logical or linear. Yep. A microcopy line could help to know how to navigate. I'm not sure what a microcopy line is. So whoever said that, if you want to drop in the chat what that means, that would be really helpful. Yep, it was hard to see the highlight box around the dropdown. Yeah, because of the background color of my dashboard there, it was really difficult to see whether I had selected onto that or not. Cool, thanks for that feedback. So this is a dashboard that I did not design with accessibility in mind. It was just one of my Makeover Monday dashboards that I chose. If I were to try and change that, what I would do is, a lot of people mentioned, is try to tab around my worksheet or this browser window. And you can see here, as I tab, certain things get highlighted on the browser window. So I'm pressing tab, tab, tab. You can see that that moves around the different browser elements. And what one person said is, takes a lot of tabbing, which it does. I'm still tabbing just to get to the dashboard. Now I'm actually on the dashboard, and I may be able to focus onto this. There I can see one of my charts got highlighted. You can see the blue around it now. That blue outline means that this is what I'm focused on. And what another person said was the focus order is not linear. It's not logical, which is totally true. It jumps from this chart on the left to this one on the right, now to the center. Now, finally, I'm on the change units. I can press space, and I can use the arrow keys to go down to pounds instead. So now I've changed it. A lot of work, particularly because of some of the design choices that I made or didn't make in this dashboard. Something that might help you here, and Sophie will drop it in the chat, is the keyboard accessibility information for Tableau on the web. So this tells you exactly how you can use a keyboard to interact with Tableau visualizations. A lot of good information here. If you have any users that are keyboard only users, you definitely want to make sure that you provide them this information, because some of it is intuitive and follows kind of the rules that are generally established on the web, but other things are not quite as obvious. For instance, using Control-Shift-Enter to bring up that view data pane. Let's talk a little bit more about focus order now. So you've seen the example, how that focus little blue box kind of jumped around my dashboard. So the order that we move around a dashboard as we press that tab button is called the focus order. The default focus order in Tableau is set by the order that you bring sheets into the dashboard. So the first sheet will be the first thing that gets highlighted. The second sheet will be the second thing. And that's not just sheets, that's also objects. The only way that you can directly adjust that is by editing the ID in the zone tag within the XML. And for those of you who haven't looked at the XML before, this is what the XML for a Tableau dashboard looks like. So these are kind of all the instructions and settings that Tableau reads to create a dashboard. And it's this zone tag right here that determines the order that a dashboard will get shown in. And it's particularly the ID attribute within that. So for instance, 14 will get shown before 24, will get shown before a higher number. The lower the ID number is, the earlier it will be in the layout. Sophie's going to drop a link in the chat that goes into much more in depth about how you can edit this yourself if you've already got a dashboard created and you want to change that focus order. Generally, though, for simple dashboards, it's easier if you can just try and drag things in the correct order. Now, it's not always possible, but if you can, again, design with that in mind, you can make it a lot better. All right, moving on from focus order now. Let's talk about mark selection and tooltips. One thing that I was surprised to find when I was trying to learn about accessibility in Tableau is that mark selection and actions are both not supported for keyboard navigation. So if you're not using your mouse, you cannot view any sort of tooltip on the dashboard, which means if there's any critical information that you need to make sure that all your users get in your dashboard, you should not put that in a tooltip. That should be somewhere already apparent on the dashboard. That also holds true for actions. So if you've got some sort of filter action in your dashboard that's required for using it, anybody who's not using a mouse will not be able to actually access that action. So the alternative is to really make use of that view underlying data pane. Again, that's Control-Shift-Enter for anybody using a keyboard. That's where the tooltip information will appear. So even if you don't have it visible on the chart, it will appear in the view underlying data pane. Another thing to keep in mind, for, again, a variety of reasons, is the number of marks and the mark type. So views with over 1,000 marks are not going to be conforming to the WCAG standards. And it's a little bit technical why, but if you have too many marks, your Tableau visualization is going to be rendered by the server, the Tableau server that holds it, rather than by someone's browser, which means all the different little elements in that dashboard are not going to be available to be read by something like a screen reader that parses out the different elements of a web page so that it can read them aloud. So making sure that you reduce the number of marks is helpful for that reason, but also just because you get too many marks and it becomes difficult to interpret the dashboard anyway. So this is another one of those universal design principles where, yeah, there's a technical reason not to do it, but also there's a reason just to make your dashboards more interpretable by everybody. Another just little thing to know about is that the polygon mark type is always rendered by the server. So if you've got a polygon mark type in your dashboard, that is always going to force a server-side render. Okay, moving on from the keyboard accessibility now, I'm going to talk a little bit about screen readers. Screen readers are software that's used by people with impaired vision typically. And what it does is it takes information from what's called the document object model and verbalizes it for the user. Basically, it can deconstruct all the parts of a website, or sometimes it's used with just desktop software, and read it out loud, put it into an auditory format for someone to use. Some examples are JAWS, which stands for Job Access with Sound. This is one of the oldest and most widely used private softwares. There's also NVDA, which is an open source screen reader. Sophie will drop a link to that NVDA in the chat. And there's also VoiceOver. So if you use Mac, you can just press Command and F5, and that will turn on VoiceOver, which is Apple's native screen reading application. Oftentimes, screen readers are used in conjunction with keyboard controls. So if you have visual impairment, it's very difficult to see the mouse cursor on the screen, if not impossible. So oftentimes people who are using screen readers are also keyboard-only users. I'm just going to give you an example for how a Tableau dashboard gets read by a screen reader. So I need to shift my share a little bit here. So I'll stop it and then I'll restart it on a particular browser page. Just give me a moment. All right, I'm going to play this video, and this is me accessing a dashboard that I created on Tableau Public. If you don't have your, I guess you probably already have your volume up so you can hear me. So I'll just go ahead and click play.
Accessibility test Smith Tableau Public Google Chrome. Accessibility test Smith Tableau Public Document. Main landmark. Download link. Accessibility test Smith Tableau Public Document. Main application. Application. Filter select a weak inclusive combo box space. 28/12/2022 21/12/ Filter select a weak inclusive combo box collapsed 28/12/2020. Application. All. Checkbox checked. Space. Not checked. Alert top selling products. Not checked. All. Checkbox not checked. List. Central checkbox. Space. Checked. List. Central checkbox checked. Sales metrics for week of 21/12/2020, Central Region. Sales $5,745 graphic press ESC to profit. Top 10 products with highest sales for week of 21/12/2020 top selling product on guest stacker chair to open view data pane, click Ctrl, Shift, enter graphic bar chart of sales for each product. Color shows profit ratio. The context is filtered on first day of week, which keeps 21/12/2020, as well as region which keeps central.
All right. I'll go back to my normal share now. So that might have felt a little overwhelming to you. I know it definitely is to me when I hear it. But I think it's important to understand how someone with visual impairments or blindness would be able to interpret a Tableau dashboard. And for folks that use screen readers on a regular basis, kind of that jarring sound or that feeling of overwhelm actually decreases a lot after using it for a while, and it just becomes sort of your normal way of navigation. But some things about how that screen reader interacted with the Tableau dashboard to notice. Some things it could read, and other things it couldn't. So the things that a screen reader can read are all the sheet titles. So that includes any sort of fields that you've included, as long as you've made that title visible on the dashboard. So one thing that you might have noticed in that video for the chart in the center of the dashboard is that it read out the whole title, including some of the information about the top selling product. And there's some clever ways that you can use window calculations and things like that to actually bring some of the top line information from your chart into the title so that it can be read aloud by the screen reader. All captions that are made visible on the dashboard, including dynamic fields, can be read by the screen reader. Any sort of legend titles or text, filter titles or text objects can be read, but oftentimes only when you're in a particular mode called browse mode in the screen reader, rather than the focus mode. Alt text, which we've described before, Some extension text can be read, and information from that view underlying data table. Some things that cannot be read, anything in a tooltip, anything in your chart area. That includes axis labels or titles, any headers, or anything in the actual chart area. Even if you're making a table in Tableau, that table cannot be read by a screen reader. Somebody would need to use that view underlying data table. I know that this is kind of a long list, but again, this presentation will be made available. So if you need to return to it to find that list, you're more than welcome to. The basic principle here is whenever you can, use those native title functions, whether it's for your parameters, filters, your chart titles, your dashboard titles. They have specific instructions that are read aloud by screen readers for how to interact with them. So for instance, if you press space on a drop-down, it drops down and lets you select. And the screen reader actually reads aloud information for how to interact with that dashboard element. So including the titles, make sure that that interactive text instruction is read aloud. One extension that I really like is data tables. And Sophie will drop the link in the chat for this. This is originally built by Ton Huang, who runs the exceptional Tableau Magic blog. It's sandboxed by Tableau, so you can also use it on Tableau Public. This creates a table, which you can see here in the middle, that is much more easy to interact with for someone who has using keyboard controls. So you can basically turn any of your charts into a data table instead. You can sort it by any of these different field names, and you can navigate around that table much more easily to view or hear the values in it. Another thing to think about is consider using download buttons. So you can download the data from a dashboard by clicking the download button in the top right if you're using Tableau Server, or even better, you can include a download button now with newer versions of Tableau, which lets you export that data to something like Excel. Excel has been around for a long time and has actually done a lot of work on accessible interaction with its software. So somebody might be a lot more familiar interacting with data in Excel. I know that sometimes we think, oh, well, we don't want to have the user pull the data in some other place, but I think when we're thinking about accessibility technology, like it's, again, all about making sure that everybody can get the insights that they need. That's what's the most important thing at the end of the day. And if that means they need to be able to pull that data into a new software program to do that, then we should make that easy for them. Like I said, you can use those new download dashboard objects to make that really easy for the end user. All right, we're getting close to the end here, but I just want to make a couple notes about neurodiversity. Some examples of this include ADHD, ADHD, and dyslexia. There's some high-level principles that, again, kind of just line up with universal design to make your dashboards easier to interpret for folks like this. Using larger text and fewer marks, including the ability to easily filter down to just fewer marks. Really no more than 10 colors or shapes, and even at that point, you're pushing it. Try to keep the number of colors or shapes to a minimum, including a main takeaway that you want people to get in your title. Again, that could be dynamic, like I showed you in the screen reader example, using window calcs. And explaining the graph and the caption. So making sure that the explanation is there and making that caption visible on the dashboard so it can be read by a screen reader. Clear and explicit instructions for how to use the dashboard. Don't just rely on symbols. Sometimes we can live a little too much in like the hieroglyphics world where we assume everybody knows what every symbol means, but trying to make sure that we actually explain it in text as well. Avoiding visual overload, both for the number of marks within your charts and the number of charts on your dashboard. And try not to rely on a single signal for your most important message, right? So how can we provide this data in multiple ways? And that can rub up a little bit against people who say, well, is that double encoding? I'm actually not, I don't really have a problem with double encoding, particularly when it has to do with your top line metrics that you're trying to get across to your end user. Providing that data in multiple ways is actually not always a bad thing. All right, so that's almost the end of this talk. There's a few other helpful tools and resources that Sophie's just going to drop in the chat one after another. First one is this Funkify Chrome extension, which is a cool extension for simulating a variety of impairments. We've got a color palette contrast checker, Color Oracle, which is a great desktop application where you can view your whole desktop in a variety of different sort of colorblind facsimiles. We've already given you that instruction for how to edit the XML in your Tableau dashboard. There's also a link to a Tableau Accessibility FAQ. This is the page that's sort of like the laundry list for Tableau of all the different accessibility blogs and options and stuff that's there. There's a lot to go into. There's Kelly Gupton's Tableau Conference 19 presentation, which goes into even more depth than I have in this webinar. And then there's Chartability, which is just a good rubric if you're trying to look for just a checklist of like, oh, is this an accessible element of my dashboard? Is this, Chartability is a good just laundry list of things you should be thinking about. And then if you just want to be involved in the social media talk around this, you can follow hashtag A11Y on Twitter. That's a Twitter hashtag for all things accessibility related in the digital sphere. Okay. Thank you for joining, everybody. I did nail it, just under 2 p.m. here. I'll stick around for a few minutes to answer questions, because I know I haven't had a chance to do that during the presentation. Otherwise, thank you for joining, and I hope you start to use this in your dashboard soon.
Hi, everyone. Sophie here again. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any questions for Colin, please type them into the Q&A and he'll be able to answer them for you. I know we've had lots of comments in the chat, so Colin will have a look over that as well. Now, no, we're on time, so if you do have to leave, thank you so much again for joining. And as I said before, this presentation has been recorded and I'll post the links out to the recording tomorrow for everyone. So thank you again for joining. And Colin, do you want to start answering some of those questions in the Q&A?
Sure, thanks, Sophie. So we have a question from Stephanie Evergreen. Can you give an example of a title that would or wouldn't work? So for this, I would just say using the titles that are the default in Tableau is a good start. I can try and pull up Tableau just to give you an example. But titles that include information on how to interact with the chart, some top line metrics that work. Uh-oh, this is going to ask me to register. Let's see if it just lets me jump into Tableau. Oh boy. Well, maybe I don't know why I suddenly can't use Tableau, but maybe I won't do that for the moment. Anyway, titles that don't work are generally the ones that are hidden on the dashboard. Creating titles that are separate from your actual chart visualization is also something to avoid. Hope that answers your question. Sorry if it's not a specific example. All right, we have a question from Matt saying, will this video be shared so I can send to my team? The answer to that is yes. Sophie will make that available on the Information Lab website, I believe. One attendee asks, are web page objects readable by a screen reader? That's a great question, and I honestly don't know. So that would be something you'd want to try for yourself. Download that NVDA open source software if you're using Windows, or you can just use Command 5 if you're on a Mac and test it out yourself. That's a great question, though. And then Matt says, Sophie answered my question already. Okay, cool. I'm going to look through the chat here as well to see if there's questions coming that way. Let's see. One person says maybe accessibility should be criteria in current IN bids round. Yeah, I think that would be amazing. It would force people to really think differently about the way that they're designing their visualizations. Cool. I think that's pretty much all the questions. So thank you, everybody, again. Oh, Hamad has a voice question. Sophie, is it possible to give Hamad the ability to speak the question out loud?
Sure is. Just give me a second, Colin.
Yeah.
I will go. Allowed to talk. Okay, Hamad, you should be allowed to talk right now.
Hi, thank you very much, Sophie. Hi. Okay, I wanted to basically ask you, in terms of what about people with visual difficulties, for example, as you can see that when you're using a dashboard, yes, I mean, even for example, if your clients, okay, now sometimes I'm sure you know this, that some of them might not have, might be colorblind and that sort of thing. And even, or some might be also can't maybe distinguish between different objects. How would one counter that basically when you're designing a dashboard? How would you suggest? What would you suggest, I mean?
Yeah, totally. I think the first thing to do would be to sit down with that person in particular and talk about what works for them, what doesn't, how they're typically using a computer. Are they using a screen reader? And then kind of go through an iterative process for them. So try making a test dashboard, sitting down with that person and saying, you know, does this work for you? Can you find the information you need from it? There's not going to be any sort of silver bullet in those sorts of cases, I think. So the most important thing is to just work with that user to understand more deeply what works for them and what doesn't. But generally, thinking really deeply about the focus order, thinking about your color contrast, thinking about your text size is going to be helpful. Does that help?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it does. It does, Colin. Thank you very much. And just one last thing. I just had an idea. So for example, let's say when you're, constructing a dashboard for any client, okay, who might be vision impaired, okay, or even in normal cases, wouldn't be a good idea to maybe create a sort of an audio recording of after you actually have constructed the dashboard, or even doing that, just so that people who might not have that visual ability as such, so that they could actually maybe on the side, if you got the the audio file access, so they could possibly just play the audio file while they're having looked through the information, what they're trying to discern from the dashboard. Wouldn't that be a good idea as such? Don't you think?
Yeah, I absolutely think that's a good idea. Providing instructions for how to use your dashboard in multiple ways is awesome. Sure. You know, so maybe you have a link to a video that you go to from your dashboard, you know, something like that. And then when you use a screen reader, making sure that you've got that usage information in your title text and your caption text. Yeah, absolutely. I love that.
Okay, thank you very much, Colin. I would really like to, would be nice to get in touch with you later on if that would be possible. I don't know.
Sure, yeah. At Colin All Data on Twitter is probably the easiest way to do that. Colin with 2 L's.
Oh, at Colin All Data, right?
Yep.
Okay, thanks a lot. Have a nice day.
You too, Mad.
All
right. Anybody else who's still here? You have questions? feel free to drop it in the chat or the Q&A. Otherwise, I think we'll be closing things down.
Thank you everyone for joining. It looks like everyone's just dropping off. So if you do have any more questions for Colin, you can always ask him on Twitter. He's just posted his Twitter handle into the chat. And you could also, and I managed to post it in mixing, and you can also reach out to us at events, events at theinformationlab.co.uk if you have any more questions. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon. Thank you, Colin. And see you guys at our next event. Bye.
Thank you.